Hi, my name's Emily Zak. I'm here at Show Studio again, and we're going to be talking about all things New York Fashion Week, sustainability, or what we thought were some of the highlights from the shows. And I'm joined by Josh.
Hi, I'm Joshua Graham. I'm the editorial assistant here at Show Studio.
Great. So let's get right into it. I think obviously New York Fashion Week is still ongoing. We still have a few more days, but just as a kind of a quick snapshot so far, I'd love to know your thoughts. I felt like there were some interesting shows. It feels like certainly there were some highlights so far, but in general, I think a lot of people, the feeling is more just, in terms of a sustainability angle, I'm not sure that I really see as much as I would like to see. And I should caveat that by saying that New York has always, in my opinion, led the way when it comes to trying new things and adopting new ways of doing things. And I've always had a lot of respect for New York Fashion Week and the brands that show there because they are always the first to adopt new tech, new ways of approaching creativity. But I just feel like this is a missed opportunity because whereas I see a lot of small brands trying to use dead stock and upcycling, I feel like overall, I think some of the big brands are missing an opportunity here. And even some of the smaller brands are just not kind of making a very clear statement about sustainability.
I think it's really interesting that this New York Fashion Week so far, it feels like it's a pre-COVID Fashion Week, just with the amount of people showing and the way it's being shown. After we've had, I think, years of conversation about how fashion needs to change and how we need to be more creative and more sustainable with how we present our collections, everyone feels really willing to go back to this already set traditional model.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that people realized maybe when we were, everyone was so committed to doing digital shows and trying to be more sustainable, maybe reduce the amount of collections. I think what was clear pretty quickly is that there's a whole economy that exists around the fashion shows themselves, whether it's almost as if it's sort of like a trade show meets a social media kind of extravaganza. And I think for a lot of the shows, what you see is like this almost, I'm not going to say desperation, but it feels almost, there's a very clear intentionality in that they are trying to get social media coverage. So, it just feels like that's maybe that conflicted with this desire to be more sustainable or reduce the amount of shows or reduce the physical shows, because those things, to have that kind of social media buzz, you need to have a moment that's sort of clearly defined and very visual. And I think that's the through line that's been across all the shows. Even brands that maybe have made sustainability part of their belief system or their approach, I think it feels like it's kind of slipped a little bit.
I immediately think of Colleen Estrada.
Yeah, same.
Because that's exactly what they did. The brand ethos of sustainability and upcycling, and I think ideas of what maybe the core of the brand's values are.
Yeah, and I'm very aware that brands have been through a lot in the last couple of years, and simply being commercially viable is not a bad thing. It's an important thing. These are businesses after all. But I agree with you. I think there's just there's a very subtle intentionality that I feel like is just changing. And even if it's still really important to the founders to have sustainability as part of the brand's ethos, it just feels like that's not as clear to the audience as it maybe has been in the past. I agree. But also, I think this is kind of on the back of Copenhagen Fashion Week, where we saw like a really clear commitment to, making sort of a standard minimum of sustainability. And that's why I think it feels almost quite a contrast to Copenhagen.
Well, I just don't think sustainability was on anyone's radar in New York. I don't think it was a buzzword or a topic broached by any of these brands, and not in a we don't care about sustainability, just in a they weren't thinking about it, or it wasn't what they wanted to prioritize.
I think there was some thinking about it, but I think it wasn't put forward front of house. It wasn't put forward as the show's focus. And even looking at some of the reviews quickly, I didn't see sustainability mentioned in the reviews. So I wondered, maybe that's also a change in me, but I think that in general, we just don't have clear metrics or measurability in these areas yet. And even if it's just a general sense of like, yeah, it didn't feel to me either that that was the priority. We're just like, I mean, even just the level of plastic use, if you want to be really specific about that. But I think, like, were there any shows that you felt did make that clear? Or did they sort of speak to you?
Sustainability-wise?
Yeah.
No, I don't think so. I question a lot about what the point of hosting like a fashion show, especially at the scale of like an international fashion week, like New York, like really what the point is. I think obviously during COVID, a lot of brands, big and small, were being creative in how they want to present their collections, whether it would be through really fun lookbooks or fashion films. And to see everyone so ready and so willing to go back to such a traditional format feels a little stale, a little boring, especially when the clothes, I think, are such extravagant moments. This was Rodarte's runway return after a season of really great high production lookbooks. And this collection, I thought, would have worked so well in a fashion film or in a really great lookbook. It was so cinematic. I don't necessarily know if hosting a runway show like that was the best medium to showcase their creativity.
I mean, I think it's just a question that you have to think, who is a fashion show for? And I think we've never really answered that question clearly. And it was my job at Vogue to think about that, so I've thought a lot about it. And I just think that it's not a straightforward proposition. I think the fact is that fashion shows were, in the past, very much a trade event, geared at insiders in the industry, and that's completely changed. So fashion shows are, for the most part, there for people who are outside of the fashion circle as well, if not primarily now at this point. So I think that formula has changed, and so it's not really up to just the people within the fashion industry to decide that anymore. So I think that's partly what the complication has been there in terms of moving maybe towards a more sustainable, less kind of travel dependent, having so many people in one place. I think that's part of the issue, is that we're just not that clear who this is for.
Yeah, or it's prioritizing this notion of grandiose spectacle over, I think, why we're all here, which is clothing or creativity.
Or are we all? I mean, there are some people who are there for, at fashion shows at least, they're there for the networking, or they're there perhaps to get that perfect shot. And so there's a lot of, I mean, I think talking about lost opportunities, I think one of the things that the brands have clearly had to do is think a little bit deeper about what their value system or value systems are, because they've had to think how they're going to come out. I imagine a lot of thought went into this show. I thought it was a beautiful show. I thought the clothing was really beautiful. I just felt that maybe we might have seen something different, like something that had come out of all those years of not showing, as you say, like something that might have been learned from all of those beautiful filmed productions, as you say.
I think there was such a grandiose movement in the clothes that could have really been elevated through a film, through something other than just the 40 models walking up and down a runway. And even like the set, I don't know if it's like the greatest, most imaginative set.
Yeah.
I do love the collection, though. I think it's really good.
I think it's beautiful. It will look beautiful. It seems like, I think fashion designers are thinking much more about where these clothes are going to be. And maybe that's partly answering the question of who this is for, because it feels like this is for A-list celebrities that might wear this on the catwalk, and that's going to give these brands so much more exposure than being necessarily in an editorial, for example, which is really what the aim used to be in the past. I think editorial is still an amazing vehicle, but I think that red carpet and that social media coverage is so much more important for them, or as important at least. But no, I agree. I think it felt like there could have been more. Maybe that's a little unfair, but I think because it's the first New York comes first, so there's a lot of expectation in terms of what they could, what they could be doing that they're not. Yeah, I mean, were there any other shows that you felt that maybe did this well, or even if there wasn't that kind of clear sustainability pitch, what were some of the shows that you felt stood out?
I think Puppets and Puppets is a really interesting brand to look at, especially where they are in their careers now, because they've really been touted as this downtown cool cult label. They really started off as a artist collective, and I think you can see that in a lot of their early work, and even in this collection with the sculptural motifs. But I also think there's a wearability and a saleability in their last few collections, this one included, that sees maybe their values going more towards a commercial venture rather than a purely creative, artistic presentation.
Yeah.
They have that bag that they push really heavy on Instagram. It's like that black leather with just like an egg or a chocolate bar on it. And I guess the cynic in me sees it as them really pushing a product or really pushing something that they want everyone to own, rather than creating something that might mean something or might change how we look at fashion.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's tricky because fashion brands have to ride this line between authenticity and creative vision and pushing the brand forward. Because I think that's what a fashion show is about. It's almost, you're showing the brand at its kind of highest level and you're inspiring a dream around the brand, and that can inform the advertising, it can inform who the customer is or isn't. So it has a lot of power in that sense, but I think it must be difficult for brands, especially smaller brands, because they have to be businesses and they have to be successful businesses. Otherwise, all of that kind of creativity and connection and collaboration, it won't have, the ability to be out there in the world. So I think it's always a tricky line to ride.
I mean, at the end of the day, it is business, and I think everybody wants to make money where money can be made. But Puppets and Puppets this season, I really thought about what is a small brand these days, and should small brands stay small brands? Do we need everyone to succeed at such an enormous level? Do we need them to grow in such a way and have an it product that billions of people own? Do we need that? I mean, with the conversations on sustainability, should we let creatives create something that doesn't necessarily have to sell at the level that maybe we thought a successful brand should sell at?
I mean, I think it's tricky because every brand is going to feel that pressure. I actually think that it's a good moment to talk about Parenza at this point in time, because that's a brand that I think has really traversed a lot of these questions and in a way when they started, they were just these kind of raw creatives, and they were going for this kind of purism of creative vision. But I think they've gone through kind of difficulty even before COVID of having to prove that they had the chops business-wise and not having that figured out and realizing they had to have that figured out. So I think it was a little bit of a kind of coming of age as creatives. I really liked this show. I liked that they embraced kind of their friends and used them not so much as muses. I always kind of really object to that. It feels very kind of othering, but like really included their friends and these women who've influenced them in the sort of production and the creation and the styling of these clothes. And I thought that was really lovely. It's sort of giving back to their customer, their audience, and their friends in a way that feels really generous, and it's not always the case. But I do think they're an interesting case study there. It's like, what is this all about? Do they have to be big? Do they have to be commercially successful? And I mean, they've sort of shown both sides of that, I think.
Yeah. I think there were really two schools of thought with the fashion show so far at New York Fashion Week, in that there's quite an austere minimalism in a lot of these presentations, and showcasing something that is so wearable or so easily adopted into anyone's wardrobe, versus the big kind of spectacles like Rodarte or even Marc Jacobs, like a week before. But then I guess it is just a question of if this needed to be a show.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think whenever you talk to people who are sort of in the space, as I used to go to every single show, and it feels when you're there that of course you need to have the show in person, because there's, as I said, there's this economy built around the show itself. There's not just the fashion show and the trades people that are there to buy, but there are photographers, and there's production, and there's set design, and there's makeup artists, and there's hair design. It's sort of like everything about the fashion industry kind of comes to this head, or this apex, if you will. And so if you're looking at it in a positive light, it's sort of like seeing the best things coming together. And I mean, most industries have an equivalent, you know? So in that sense, I see the value. Myself, I've experienced that. But I also think that the industry just has not stuck by this kind of introspective deep dive that it had. And it feels like, that feels to me like a missed opportunity. And I don't think all brands that are showing need to show. Yeah. I think, to your point, like, you could be a small brand and save the expense of, shows are very expensive. Yeah. So save on the expense of that and show to a more kind of niche audience and cultivate that in a more organic way. I think there's a lot of validity to that.
Yeah. I think big brands also need to maybe think about the system, or continue thinking about the system, and how they can present something in a new, creative, and ultimately maybe a more sustainable way. Because if they do continue placing such a value on the runway show as the apex of high fashion, then it's gonna just keep the small brands aiming for something that I think we've proven isn't sustainable.
Yeah.
And then you do see it with like small brands like Puppets and Puppets whose trajectory is following what's been set out for them rather than offering a new system.
Yeah, I think there's some truth in that. But I also think that there's like the brands. I mean, I feel like the fashion industry is a little bit where the automotive industry was about 20-something years ago, in that we sort of know there's a problem. Mm-hmm. We have the numbers. We know what the contribution the fashion industry makes to, you know, to the environment, to damage in the environment, to the amount of dead stock and waste that's produced. But we're sort of still not willing to completely acknowledge it. And I don't know that necessarily the automotive industry is completely ready now either, but I think there's a level of kind of knowing that there's a problem and not quite knowing how far they want to change their business models. But the reality is that there are regulations that are changing, there are laws coming into place that I think will make brands have to make those changes, not just to the shows themselves, but to the entire business model, to the supply chain, to how things are sourced, and thinking really about that garment and how it, what its lifespan is past the customer. So I think that's the opposite of this kind of meme sort of idea of trying to make this kind of moment on social media. This is much more about making clothes that are going to have a long life, are going to be able to be repaired, are made of fibers that can biodegrade. That's a completely different way of working. And I don't think it's just about the fashion show. I think it's about like business as usual. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, maybe brands have to be forced to make that change, to really make that change.
Yeah, I just think everyone is really averse to change. And even your point on creating virality, I think it works so well because the audience gets so captivated by something so cartoonish or stupid, like those red rubber boots that are all over my Twitter page. That like if it works for these brands. So why would they stop doing it? I think any change has to come from a really authentic desire to change the system, and maybe at a cost, because I think what works in making money is what's destroying the planet and making us all cynics when it comes to fashion.
Well, you could argue that creating new clothes is, very few people need a lot of new clothes, but I think it's also undeniable that fashion is joyful. We all need to, I mean, a lot of people in the industry say, well, we all need to wear clothes. We don't all need to wear clothes that are high fashion, but that's beside the point. I think there's such joy and vibrancy and creativity that I still love about our industry. And I think the way I see it is, I think
you can be cynical or you can sort of see this as an opportunity. And I think that the brands that have in the past at least seen this as a kind of creative opportunity, they're the ones that I'm really interested in. I mean, I think some of the brands that are like maybe working in a slightly different way, so whether it's Heron is sort of creating sustainable streetwear, I think that's an incredibly interesting concept, because streetwear just by definition is like this whole idea of box fresh and being very like, you know, if it's even slightly flawed, you get rid of it, and it's very disposable. Yeah. So this idea of like upcycling streetwear and dead stock in that sense, I think there are brands and creatives that are using this as a creative impetus, that are seeing it as an opportunity. And actually maybe, you know, you were saying that the smaller brands are looking to the bigger brands. I actually think the bigger brands look to some of the smaller brands to sort of gauge the zeitgeist, like where they need to be. So I think in that sense, we can get some hope from some of the smaller brands that are taking a lot more risks and putting themselves out there, trying new things. Even if it's not that scalable, I think the bigger brands look at that and think, oh, okay, we need to be doing more than we are. So I'd like to sort of see it as an opportunity too. Otherwise, it's just too depressing. So, and I think New York, again, coming back to what we were saying before, I believe New York actually could be the first to be a very sustainable fashion week if they decided that that was really what they wanted to prioritize and followed in the footsteps of like a Copenhagen Fashion Week, because they are just that much further ahead in terms of, you know, if they see that there's commercial sense in it, I think they'll do it. And I guess I'm here, I want to say I think there is. I think there is commercial sense and creative sense as well. It's an opportunity to do something different.
I think it's and I feel like I've come off quite negative when it comes to fashion shows and presentations. I do love a fashion show. I do want it to be big and entertaining, and I want the clothes to reflect that. I think it's just when it doesn't, it feels wasteful.
Yeah.
And I do want these brands and want young designers and established designers to really utilize this platform in a creative way. I don't want the same roster of models walking up and down in your summer show.
Yeah.
I want it to say something. I want it to push boundaries.
I mean, I think in the past, New York has been very good on diversity of body shape, age, skin color. I'm not sure that it really did as well as it has in the past. I've sort of just did a quick glance through it. It looks pretty good. I mean, you could sort of look at the end of the show. We still have a few more days. I think New York does get some things right, and I think it gets a bit of a bad rap in the creative circles, because Paris and Italy are seen as, Paris and Milan, I should say, are seen as these kind of creative, they're pushing the boundaries in terms of creativity, and they have very big fashion houses there, but I think New York, I love some of the kind of smaller brands coming out of New York, and I think there is this kind of, this feeling that they are pushing something, they're pushing the boundaries. I think they could do a lot more than they are doing, to your point, but I feel like,
I think the young brands are really pushing like a youthful energy. I think Colleen Estrada is a really great example of that. I think they like to have fun. They take a stance on sustainability. Eckhouse Lotta, I think, is also really great at that. They have a brand message around ideas of identity and community.
There's also Rent Triage. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, but I think that they're doing some interesting work, because I think she's really using dead stock and vintage pieces and upcycling them. And then there's so many questions I have about how easy those things are to scale. But again, I wonder if there isn't this kind of cross-pollination of these small brands trying these things out, which can then be sort of borrowed or looked at by some of the bigger brands. I'd really love to see, like a Michael Kors and Tommy. I'd like to see more steps towards sustainability from those brands, because they have incredible power, and I know that they believe in those principles. So you just would love to see them taking a bit more of a stance in those areas.
I think New York especially gets kind of the bad rap of the fashion weeks because of the value it places on being commercial, on like saleability. I think Tommy and Michael Kors are the biggest real examples of that, no matter what their big show is, it's only to advertise their brands and to sell. I mean, the bottom line is more because it lines your pockets. And
Yeah.
it isn't necessarily creativity for creativity's sake or pushing fashion in a way. So I mean, I do think these young New York labels are doing such a great job at maybe developing a design language so outside the box. And I just want them to stay like that.
Yeah,
I don't
you
want them to fall
get
into
too
the
big.
trap of this works, let's do it in blue and then in yellow and then sell it in as many neutral colors as we can because it'll fund our next show. It is that fine line.
Yeah, I think it's a very hard, it's a lot to expect of a small brand, not to think commercially, but I think maybe one of the ways that some of these small brands can really do both of those things, and I think they do this, whether they want to or not. I mean, coming back to the Proenza kind of example, I think, you know, they were and are huge in a very sort of niche, they're still a very small brand, effectively, even though they have, I'd say, global recognition. People know them, who they are, but outside of a fashion, friends of mine who are attorneys do not know they don't know that brand. So I think there's this kind of, how successful do you need to be considered a successful fashion brand? And if the aim is for, you know, I think now more and more brands are sort of selling to a much more niche audience, you know, to your point. So I think that's really interesting as well.
Well, I think about like young brands in London, like Phoebe English or Stephen Cook, who don't really feel like they're aiming for something bigger or to become these household names. And it's almost there. I think there's a sweet spot in what a fashion brand should be today.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I feel like we have to be careful not to sort of put too many restrictions on fashion. I think fashion's been through a lot, and we have to I think where we should be focusing our parameters is really more about how, like, what is the social what is the responsibility that these brands have to be sustainable? My feeling is, and I could be wrong, but my feeling is that if brands started earlier, baking that into what they do and their value system and their creative process, because I went to art school, and it's all is, you know, any obstacle or any challenge becomes a creative challenge, and I'm just not sure why brands are not embracing sustainability as a creative challenge, or it doesn't seem that they are, and I think it could be. So is it a question of it just baking that in earlier on and thinking about this right out of, you know, school and how you can approach things differently? And I think we see that in some of these smaller brands out of New York, but I think London is a great example of that. There's so many brands that are sort of focusing in that way, in that very kind of, they have a very specific audience in mind, and they're just designing for that audience.
No, I mean, I completely agree that I think sustainability needs to be on the checklist. It needs to be a conversation that these creatives have.
Yeah. But also, we just need to decide what that means. What are the parameters of that?
Yeah.
And I don't think there's enough of a consensus yet. And then that makes it much harder for brands to prioritize, right? If they don't have a clear sense of what they need to do. Yeah. So I think that can be the next step for maybe ahead of next New York Fashion Week. But I mean, also just coming back to the shows, you know, it's all relatively, it's very recent, this kind of level, this scale of fashion show. It's not, I was thinking about the history of the fashion show. And if you go far back enough, which isn't that long ago, it was for a very niche customer. It was really only until ready-to-wear was just sort of established by Yves Saint Laurent that even that concept of a fashion show really began in kind of in the 70s, not that long ago. Yeah. So I think this is still an evolving space, and one that I think we can change. We're not just like beholden to what's worked before. I think we should be changing it. And I think some brands should, as you say, think about maybe it works better for them to do it as a beautiful video, or doesn't have to be showing in person to a huge audience.
I think it's up to everyone in fashion to maybe not hold the fashion show as the pinnacle of a presentation and base someone's, I guess,
Everybody
success.
wants to go to the fashion show.
Yeah, I know. Well, that's the thing. I was thinking a lot about how today's commentators and fashion critics all come from social media. They're on TikTok and they're on Twitter, and they're the ones who reach hundreds of thousands of followers from the comforts of their bedroom. And this season, just seeing handfuls of them at the shows and like covering it as if they were always a traditional critic. And
Yeah.
it's that idea of, I guess, being consumed into the system.
Yeah.
And like, I guess because you've always viewed attending the show as the height of what a fashion critic does.
No, I think that's true. I think it would be really refreshing if you saw more of that kind of commentating that felt a lot less like just a reviewer. It sort of feels like they're just following the same formula, as you'd say. But I think there's, thinking ahead, so we've got a few more days left of New York. Do you think maybe we'll, watch the next couple of days and have a completely different perspective on New York Fashion Week? Are there any shows that you're sort of looking forward to or that you think could change the balance for you?
I think on the last day, I'm very excited for Willy Chavarria and Luar. They're both Latino designers. They both use their brands and their shows to kind of highlight notions of their identity from a really, I think, beautiful personal narrative. And it's that kind of storytelling that I think makes this short, ephemeral show exciting and worth watching.
So more like a performance artist and less like a commercial artist.
Yeah. I also do think that both of them find that sweet spot in creating garments that kind of sell the story they're telling.
No, I agree. I think it's really well put because there is something that feels very authentic and personal. And I think when a brand loses that personal kind of authenticity, it's really difficult to engage in the show. You can feel it when you're there. I think that's what Marc Jacobs does so well. It's that you just feel this is his heart out on the runway. So unless that's there, I think it's very hard to engage and feel like it's worth the expense and the time and even just being there. So I feel that's true as well.
On the kind of flip side, I think there's also going to be Tom Brown later this week, which is surely going to be an amazing spectacle. I don't think when his last runway show was, I'm not sure, but to be back in New York, I think is going to be really exciting. I think he's probably going to pull out all the stops.
No, for sure. It would be interesting to see because I do think for them it's also a little bit rusty. You get the feeling that they've kind of, it's not that they've forgotten how to do this, but it does feel like it's a slightly different, people are bringing some, I hope they're going to bring some intelligence from the digital shows that they've done and the digital productions they've done, and kind of bring that out as well. I'm hoping. Here's hoping. Well, I think, are there any thoughts that you have for, like, other than the last couple of days, anything you'd love to see that you haven't yet seen? Ooh.
I think I'd like to see, I don't know. I would like to see more drama, I think.
More drama.
I'd love to see more drama at the shows. I think the closest we've gotten so far was Rodarte. But as a show, I don't think it hit all of Marc's. I think as a collection it did, definitely. But as a presentation, I think it could have gone further.
All right, well, maybe that's a good place to end. We can reconvene after the end of New York Fashion Week. But so far, I think that's a pretty good summary.
Cool.
Lovely to chat to you, Josh.
Lovely to speak to you, Emily.